evening, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to this workshop organized by the GPODS Fellowship and EnviPol. GPODS stands for Global Policy, Diplomacy, and Sustainability. It's a fellowship where we talk about the interlinkages between these three broad disciplines: public policy, diplomacy, and sustainable development. And as part of our fellowship, we bring in some of the best leaders who are working on these issues on public policy, sustainability, and diplomacy to be speaking to you on their experiences, on their journey, and mentoring you through yours. We have, judges, diplomats, academics, CEOs, grassroots leaders who are going to be mentors in this particular fellowship. The fellowship applications are closing soon. Today is the 13th of May. The fellowship applications close on May 15th. So I would encourage anybody who's considering applying for this fellowship to submit in their applications as soon as possible. We have some of our alums over here in the room, and we have some incoming fellows who've already heard about their early decision. So Agnes being one of them. I see Agnes over there. Hello. And we also have some fellows from Global Policy Insights. I see Abhinav Chaudhary also part of this call right now. Well, that's about the fellowship. Today, you're going to also be interacting with Her Excellency Miss Veronique Roger Lacan, and that's going to happen about 2.5 hours from now. Before that, we have 2 certificate workshops coming up for you. The first is a session on intergroup conflict. So that's the one that I'm going to be talking to you about. I'm going to be talking to you about intergroup conflict from a theoretical sense, but also understanding how you apply that theory to practice, to real life. Okay. The second session that we have over here is going to be by Eeshan, who's CEO of EnviPol, and he's going to be talking about circularity and the global commons. And finally, we have a fireside chat with Her Excellency Roger Lacan, and there she's going to be talking about investing in education in the 21st century. So as you can already see, we are going to be talking about intergroup conflict, which is more political science, and then global commons, which is somewhere between economics and sustainability, and finally about education. So that's what typically our organization and this fellowship program is all about. All right, now without further ado, let me jump into the topic. Before that, let me also quickly introduce myself to you. So my name is Arpit Chaturvedi. As you can see on the screen, I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Global Policy Insights. Global Policy Insights, or GPI, it's a centrist think tank based out of New Delhi. We have teams in London and New York as well. And we work on issues ranging from international political economy to sustainability to governance. So do check out our work as well. And now, without further ado, I'm going to be talking about our topic today, which is related to intergroup conflicts. All right. When you look at intergroup conflicts, really, there are 2 things that we want to discuss. The first being the structure of intergroup conflicts. And a lot of what I'm going to be talking to you about is based out of my research in my book called Our Egalitarian Universe, which was published in 2015. And that talks about the structure of intergroup conflict. What are the sources of intergroup conflicts across the world? And then it comes up with certain recommendations on as to how you can go about addressing these conflicts, resolving these conflicts. Since then, I've gone on to research more extensively into this particular issue, and we're going to be able to touch upon some of the new work that I've done, or the new work that I've come across on this particular issue. And that's usually related to the concept of power, because you cannot really understand conflict without understanding how power operates and how power works. All right. So you can see There are many intergroup conflicts in the world. They keep happening, right from wars to, within the society, discrimination based on religion, based on caste, based on nationality, based on, tribal affiliations. And a lot of times you see these conflicts stretching out for decades, even centuries. A lot of times you see short conflicts which cause a lot of extreme humanitarian loss of property, loss of lives. In essence, intergroup conflicts are nothing new in this world. We have always lived with it, and this is perhaps one big problem. It's a public policy problem, it's a societal problem, which human beings collectively, we haven't been able to figure out the solutions of. Okay, so any work that I'm going to be discussing with you, a lot of it is from the view of practically applying some of it. Some of it has been practically applied at various levels, but it still cannot claim that it would solve all sorts of conflicts always, right? So with that disclaimer, I'm going to jump into this. All right, so the question is that why haven't we been able to figure out conflicts? How are inequalities and conflicts related, and what can we do about it? All right. So in many ways, the way that I conceptualize inequalities are that inequalities are latent intergroup conflicts. They're everywhere in the world. No two groups are equal in terms of their political, economic, cultural background. They are different. They are unequal. They have a different, mix of power, as they say, between themselves. Okay, and what is also true is that intergroup conflicts, or the division based on race, community, society, is not endemic to any one particular culture. You find it everywhere in the world, wherever you go, right? Now, I started my research from my experience working at the National Commission for Scheduled Castes in India. So this is a body institutionalized by the president of the country. And I was there, working as a researcher at some point in time. So my research essentially started from the perspective of conflicts around castes in India. Now, caste is not class, which is, more of a socio-economic concept. Caste essentially is particular to India, and caste essentially is about linking your birth with a particular occupation that has been traditionally followed by your family. Now, in the traditional caste system, there's a specific hierarchy, and that hierarchy is represented in the classical texts with this fourfold, structure of hierarchies. So number one is Brahmins, which are equated to the head of your body, because that's the group of people who do the thinking. So that's the consulting class. Then you have the Kshatriyas. They are like the arms in your torso, because that does the heavy duty work. Kshatriyas are supposed to be the caste who are supposed to be fighting all of the wars, who are supposed to be protecting the country. So war, policing, army, all of that are the professions associated to the Kshatriya caste. The Vaishyas are the commercial classes, or the agricultural classes. So they are usually engaged in industries, trade, and commerce. And Shudras are the service classes, and this section of the society is what we are most concerned with over here, because that's what the National Commission for Scheduled Castes, where I was working, was institutionalized for. Now, before we understand the specific context of the National Commission for Scheduled Castes, let me give you some more details on the caste structure. The caste structure came about in India during the later Vedic period historically, which is somewhere around 200 to 300 AD, and then extending up to about 1000 AD. The dates are debated by various historians, so you won't find the specific authoritative time period. But what happened at some point of history in India was that there was extreme professional specialization, and since unlike other Western models where you had universities which were open to everybody, to attend, in India, the method of learning was through apprenticeship. So typically, if I was born in a particular caste, I would be living amongst people who are practicing a particular profession, and I would also be practicing that profession. And if I was born into the so-called lower caste, which is the Shudras, then I would be sort of a pariah in the society. I would be working a lot of odd jobs, working in dangerous and exploitative situations. And typically the Shudras, since the later Vedic times, have been considered untouchables in the Indian caste hierarchy. And untouchability came with a lot of social stigma, a lot of economic exclusion. And that's the reason why when India got independent, there were a number of laws which were institutionalized, so that there's the systemic discrimination against the Shudras is eradicated. And for that, they literally drew a schedule, or they literally drew a list of castes which would fall into the Shudra bracket. And those castes, if somebody belonged to that, were given certain constitutional privileges. That included affirmative action in schools and in government jobs. That also included certain laws to prevent atrocities and harassment against them, and certain punitive actions if you are referring to them in a derogatory manner or practicing untouchability. Okay. Now, despite all of that legislation and despite all of the constitutional safeguards, Shudras have been discriminated against in our country in many ways for many, many years now. All right. So my question really, when I started out with this research, is what can we do to address the condition of this particular caste group being underserved by the society, and also address the sort of inequality and latent conflict that exists between this caste and the so-called upper castes, which are the rest of the three. All right. Now, what I found out was that a similar untouchability practice was also prevalent in Japan. And as late as the 1970s, you found the Buraku group being discriminated against in Japanese business organizations. In fact, the big reveal by BBC in 2014 was that there were being lists of people that was being circulated amongst the major corporations in Japan, where the meaning of being on that particular list was that you are to be discriminated against and you are never to be hired in positions of leadership. All right. Now, back to India. What I found was that this is 2012 data. Every 18 minutes, a crime is committed against a person belonging to the scheduled castes or the Shudras, so to say. And every day, 27 atrocities, which included 3 rapes, 11 assaults, and 13 murders was taking place. And every week, 5 of their homes or possessions were being burnt down, 6 persons being kidnapped or abducted every week. Okay. Now, I started digging into this matter, and while I was digging into this matter, I also got the opportunity to work with the National Foundation for Communal Harmony, which is really the body that talks about how do you bridge the divide between various religious groups, primarily the Hindus and the Muslims in India. And what I started doing was that I started working with this caste divide issue and the religious divide issue together. And I found out that in terms of caste, there used to be, in fact, there still is a prevalent discussion around the fact that can we ascribe causality to Hinduism? Do we have this particular caste conflict? Because the makeup of Hinduism as a philosophy, as a text, advocates for that hierarchical structure in a particular. And what I found, so I went to the earliest text of Hinduism available. And what I found, that is the Rig Veda. And what I found was that there's nothing really in the Rig Veda that talks about discrimination against any particular caste. I found that passages like these where people say that I'm a poet, my father is a physician, my mother is a grinder, and earning a livelihood together through different means we live together. What that means is that your birth and your profession were not were not set in stone. They were not correlated, and you could be born in a family where people are practicing different professions. So the caste hierarchy was fluid in the early Vedic period, right? What I also found was that when Hindus would migrate to other Sai, I'm just gonna be coming to your question. Okay, so when Hindus would convert to any other caste or any other religion, such as Christianity or Islam, they would reproduce similar caste structures, or I think to say that they would reproduce is unfair. They would find themselves to be part of similar hierarchical structures in some of these different religious groups as well. So in India, the Muslims would have untouchability, and the Muslims would have, on the right hand side, I've given you a number of groups, all organized hierarchically. Similarly, amongst the Christians as well, there were untouchables. So Christians discriminating against other Christians. And then again, a lot of these different groups competing for supremacy, right? So what I realized was that technically speaking, because of these two evidences, you cannot ascribe causality to Hinduism over there. So then I started, and before that, I'm just gonna address Sai's question. Would you mind to throw some light on the similarities and differences of groupings between Shudras and Dalits? I don't think that I'm the best person qualified for that. That's a totally different discipline of knowledge where you're told about what are the different subgroups and how are they hierarchically organized within a particular caste. But that's an information you can easily just Google for and you'll find it. All right. So the second is that the question was that a lot of people argued that we have the religion divide in India and the caste divide in India because of the colonial rule, because of colonists coming in India and really exacerbating those divides. And my intuition was that you cannot really, and the political science literature I'd been exposed to also said that you cannot really create a divide that doesn't exist. It's really hard to do that. You can exploit an existing divide. So which means that the causality, maybe amplification of those conflicts did happen because of the colonial rule, but the conflicts or the crevice in the society did exist, did predate the colonial rule. And if you look at historical evidence, you see, for example, various texts talking about practicing and promoting untouchability, various evidences of riots between various caste groups and riots between various communal or religious groups as well. So, for example, over here, the Gazetteer of Benares from 1809 and even earlier talks about communal riots taking place between Hindus and Muslims, where the Muslims would have destroyed an Indian Hindu temple and Hindus would have destroyed a Muslim mosque. So which means that, the colonists really did not create that conflict. They might have certainly exacerbated that. So our second candidate of causality, third-party interests or colonial rule, that's also ruled out. So a third body of literature would say that it's a rural and urban thing. You find a lot more caste divide in the rural communities and not in the urban ones. And there as well, when I looked at data, I did not really find that causality also exists quite prominently. Because if you look at the left panel over here, I decided that I'll study whether discrimination exists with two different parameters. One is from the perspective of crime, and another is the perspective of development. And for development, I took education achievements as a proxy. And for crime, you had the crime numbers available with the National Crime Records Bureau. So the left panel is for crime, and what you see over here, if you divide it into 4 quadrants, all right. Oops. So this particular quadrant shows the states which have high average incidence of crime against scheduled caste populations, and your y-axis shows the average of crime rates. So this is about rate, this is about total incidence. Okay, if you only look at total incidence, that's a problem, because if you're only looking at total incidence, then a state which just has a high amount of population in general and a high amount of scheduled caste population is likely to have higher numbers of crimes, because there's just more people in that particular state. All right. And if you're only looking at rates, then you could be looking at certain states which are really small population wise, but there are probably a lot of discrimination in those particular states. But what's happening over there is not in terms of volume or in terms of the total amount of incidences. It's not large enough for policy action prioritization. So if you look at, and I was obviously working for policymakers, so I had that perspective in mind. And what I found was that these two states, Rajasthan and Bihar, which are extremely ruralized states in India, they had high incidence and high rate of crime as well. So the rate of crime tells you that if you are a scheduled caste person, then what's the probability that you would, face some atrocity, or somebody is going to, incite violence or some sort of criminal exploitation against you. Okay, so that's how many incidences per 100 scheduled caste people. That's the rate. Okay, so these Rajasthan and Bihar came out to be states with high incidence and high rate of crimes against scheduled caste population. And these are states with, which are typically considered extremely ruralized states. So in terms of crime, you do see that it's an urban-rural sort of a thing. But if you look at, so the thesis, the hypothesis that, the rural world is more prone to such discrimination, that holds when you look at criminal data on crime. But if you look at the data on, and obviously all of these, they are somewhat also conjectural, because we don't have data, at that granular level where we could figure out that even within these states was the crime happening in urban areas or rural areas, but it's just a proxy in many ways. Now, if you look at literacy data, you see a greater urban divide. So if you look at male literacy amongst the scheduled caste population in 2011 versus all of the other population, or versus the overall male literacy rate, you see that the gap in rural areas between the scheduled caste population and the rural, between the scheduled caste population and the general population is 4.6%, and that gap increases to 5.5% in urban areas. All right, and that's been the case throughout decades. In 2001, you had a larger gap in urban areas for male literacy. And in 2011, you had the same, right? Even though the gap was closing a little, but you still had 5.5 percentage points. And similarly, if you compare it for females, scheduled caste females, 68.6% literacy in urban areas, 79.1% literacy in urban areas for general category. And in rural areas, 52.6 for scheduled caste and 57.9 for the general. So you look at the difference, there's almost a double, almost a double percentage point difference in urban areas. So in terms of literacy achievements, if you're a person belonging to a scheduled caste, you are more likely to be falling behind the literacy achievement rates in urban areas as opposed to rural areas, whether you're male or you're female. Okay. So again, if you look at the overall picture, is it exclusively a rural issue? I don't think so. It depends over there. Then another interesting thing that I really got onto, and that it's something that you cannot completely accept and completely reject, is whether it is purely an economic issue, whether the caste and the religion, it's just a veneer, and is it really an economic issue? And that's the perspectives that the Marxists would bring in, that all of the caste, all of the religious divide is essentially an economic divide. That's usually been the Marxist historiography and sociology in India. And indeed, what you find is that if in a particular community there's a scheduled caste population and there's a general non-scheduled caste population, if the economic gap between the two closes, and the economic gap could close because of the scheduled caste population doing better, or also because the general population doing worse economically, you find greater conflict. So it's almost like a balance of power sort of a thing, where if two powers or if two separate groups are coming closer to parity, then there are greater conflicts amongst them. And what you actually qualitatively find is that even when the general population is losing on their economic might, they perceive that their economic benefits are being appropriated, or the share of the pie that they have in the larger economy is being eaten into by the scheduled caste population. So that sort of an insecurity a lot of times kicks in, and that leads to greater incidences of discrimination, exploitation, etc. But it's a structural problem. It's really, in India, what I also, and there's enough research and evidence on that even when certain subgroups of underserved populations, so let's say there's a particular subgroup called the other backward castes, and the other backward castes were not, they were socially and economically considered backwards as compared to the other castes traditionally in India, but not really considered untouchables. And with Prime Minister Vishwanath Pratap Singh, VP Singh, new legislation came in favor of the other backward castes, and they, as a result of that, they gained a lot of land, property, and economically became better. And you saw, and you can, even now observe in the data, that most of the cases of atrocities against scheduled castes are incited by people belonging to other backward castes. So in a way, when, other backward castes were almost at the same position as the scheduled castes, at least economically, when they became better off politically and economically both, they sort of slipped into the shoes of the oppressors. So it's a structural problem. Structural problems are that, where you stand politically depends on where you sit in the hierarchy, right? That's the classical definition of a structural problem. So if on the hierarchy you achieved a higher position, then again you started exploiting the people who are on a disadvantageous position just because you have an advantage over there. Okay, so what I understood was that this is certainly a structural problem. The other thing was that which sort of got confirmed was that it's a structural as well as a cultural problem. So what do we mean by a cultural problem? Culture is essentially collective mindsets. And what I stumbled on were these case studies in the UK by the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, where you can see that when people belonging to the Indian cultural milieu are plugged out of India geographically. So which means that they are operating in a large, in a largely different cultural ecosystem, but they obviously have their own cultural bubbles or their own cultural mini ecosystems within it. And they are certainly in a very different economic situation. And that's where I started doubting that it's not also purely economic, because you migrate to the United Kingdom, which is more of a developed country than India, and you've sort of transcended, economic limitations that you might have as a result of your caste origins in India. Yet, in schools and in workplaces, you found a lot of cases of, and I've just quoted 2 cases in my book, but there are literally a lot of cases on this particular website, which shows you on this particular report, which shows you that there's a lot of discrimination between the caste groups in the United Kingdom as well. So the economic hypothesis really also does not stand as strong as the collective mindset or the cultural hypothesis, because it's not necessary that the person, 2 people in going to the same school, especially in the UK, there's a high correlation of them belonging to similar economic backgrounds. All right. So some of the, in fact, should be 3 trends. I don't know why I've written 2 over here. 3 broad observations that you could make from here is that there are cultural biases in every group. These biases, they turn into intergroup conflicts when there are economic or power gaps, especially when they're narrowing. And the conflicts and biases, they have a loop, that the conflicts, they feed the biases, and the biases, they feed the conflicts. Okay. All right. So the policy solution over here is really that when you're working towards the empowerment, and I know empowerment is a value-laden word, I really would say that when you're looking at policy action to make the positions of some of these disadvantaged classes better, that needs to be coupled with a mindset change amongst the advantaged groups as well. Because if you give more power, or if you facilitate situations where one group becomes more powerful, and if you want to avoid conflict, then you also need to work with the groups which have had power, traditionally, and to also work on their mindset, so that they don't see the rise of one group at the expense of their own. Okay, and that's how you that's the first broad layer of intervention. That's the broad foundational strategy. Now we are getting into the weeds of it. So the larger question, whether it's still an economic problem or an interest-based problem or a political problem or a cultural problem, there's a lively debate on that. And there are 3 broad categories of theoreticians. One are the primordialists, another are the instrumentalists, and another are what you can call as the mixed school, and that's where I find myself belonging to in many ways. So the instrumentalists, they essentially say that all of these discriminations, all of these conflicts which are happening, whether it's about race or religion or caste or whatever, it's happening because groups essentially are working towards their self-interest. It's fundamentally a question of surplus distribution in the society, how you distribute it. And for that, people compete, and that competition converts into conflict. Okay, that's the essential line of argument over there. All right. And what they also say is that a lot of times the situation, human beings, they tend to form groups, and groups find themselves at various, there's always some sort of, inequity or inequality between these groups based on where they are sitting on the structure in terms of socio-economic and political position. And that, different situation in the economic and political structure leads to greater competition and greater conflict. Okay. So what they say, and this is essentially a lot of research by Caroline and Muzaffar Sharif on the realistic conflict theory, where they say that if you want to resolve intergroup conflicts, incentives matter. Uh, a lot of times what you need to do is you need to create common goals. You need to create a situation where people, let's say, have a common enemy or a common goal with which, that goal cannot be achieved by any one group by themselves. And you need to create the right sort of situation, the right sort of incentives to be able to bridge those conflicts. And I actually want to show you a video which summarizes a really, really interesting experiment that Muzaffar Sharif and Caroline Sharif undertook. I'm going to stop sharing my video and quickly reshare it so that you can hear the sound. And there you go. It's
Between
called the Robbers Cave
1949
Experiment.
and 1954, social psychologist Muzaffar Sharif and Carolyn Wood Sharif collaborated with graduate students to hold a series of experiments to test one of Dr. Sharif's ideas, known as realistic conflict theory. This having to do with intergroup conflict, stereotypes, and prejudices. The most famous and significant of his experiments took place in 1954 at Robbers Cave State Park in Oklahoma. Sharif's main idea was that conflict arises between groups when they're competing for limited resources. This hypothesis had important implications as the Second World War had recently ended. The experiments involved 22 children between the ages of 11 and 12. None of them knew each other previously, and all came from similar backgrounds: middle class, white, and Protestant. The experiment had 3 stages, the first being a bonding stage. Before the two groups were made aware of each other, they were encouraged to bond and create social norms by engaging in activities such as swimming and hiking. Here the groups took names, the Eagles and the Rattlers, and developed their own cultures and cultural norms. The next stage was the competition stage, lasting 4 to 6 days. In this stage, there was to be friction between the groups, and as such, a series of competitions were arranged. These competitions included baseball, tug of war, and touch football, among others. The winners would receive a trophy, medals, and pocket knives. There was no alternative prize for the losers. The Rattlers, who had developed a norm of toughness and aggression, became emphatically confident in their success. They put Rattlers' flags on the baseball field and made threats about bothering them. The researchers then manipulated situations where one group would gain at the cost of the other. What started as verbal aggression between the groups soon escalated further. After one of the baseball games, the Eagles burned the Rattlers' flag. The next day, the Rattlers raided the Eagles' cabin, flipping beds and stealing personal items. Soon, fistfights would break out, and the researchers had to physically separate the children. After the end of the conflict period, where it was announced that the Eagles were the winners, there was a reducing friction period. The groups were asked to characterize the other group, and it was found that there were profoundly negative characterizations, while holding their own group in high esteem. During this time, the two groups were brought together to engage in non-competitive activities. Sharif believed that simple contact between the groups would not reduce friction. Instead, there would need to be common, superordinate goals to accomplish. In one event, the boys were to watch a movie together, but had to chip in money of their own. They worked together to decide the splitting of the money. They also had to work to fix an issue with a water tank and the water supply at camp, which the researchers had arranged. Likewise, one of the trucks delivering food became stuck and had to be pulled out by the children working together. At this point, the kids had come together, no longer as enemies, but as allies with a common goal. Muzaffar and Carolyn Sharif had successfully demonstrated realistic conflict theory. Normal boys became their own cultures and showed that conflict for limited resources can lead to prejudiced attitudes and discriminatory behaviors. While simple coexistence did not eliminate these prejudices, working together towards something better for both groups did.
All right, so this video literally tells us that when they had situations where no particular group could be able to resolve an existential crisis, such as the food van being stuck, or the water supply being affected, when no group was strong enough to address that or resolve for that, they had this common superordinate goal. And when they had that common superordinate goal, they were able to solve that particular crisis. Okay, so that's what the realistic conflict theory tells us, that the typical policy recommendations could range from a negative one, which is the common enemies approach, or it could also be a positive one, that you have a common superordinate goal. You have a common agenda that is urgent enough that brings everybody together. Okay. Now, when you have this particular policy recommendation, the fact is that this is really not enough. I'll talk about these two particular things very quickly. But essentially, when you have this policy recommendation, when you have a common enemy, let's say, that's usually a temporary, relief from intergroup conflict. If some of you have watched wrestling while growing up, you must have come across this particular format of a wrestling match where two people team up against one person, and then when they throw that person out of the ring, then they are the ones fighting each other off. And what I mean to say by that is that if our policy recommendations are really just based on realistic conflict theory, and if we are only talking about superordinate goals, that's not really a complete solution, because once that common superordinate interest disappears, so will the existing amity between these two groups, right? Now, but still, continuing with our story on the superordinate goals, or with real interests, I created two hypothetical societies which got some substantial attention in the circles discussing intergroup conflict. And these two societies I called Society 1 and Society 2. Now, I want you to read the description of Society 1. But before that, let me let me read some of the comments. Wayne is saying that, yeah, you see that between the Republicans and the Democrats as well. Absolutely, Wayne. And Sylvia has asked a question: what would happen without the said mediator? So, Sylvia, that's a good question. Mediators, they play a great role in bridging conflicts. And a lot of times when you don't have mediators, you would really not be able to bring the two parties together. But also what we need to remember is that just sitting people down in a room or increasing contact between these two groups does not really solve the situation. The mediator works on various levels on identifying common interests, but also building common identities that we're going to be talking about. A lot of times, just increased contact can lead to greater conflict rather than reduction of conflict. So that's just one thing that we need to take in mind. And what would happen without the said mediator? I think we'll find out after we look at all of the theories which are there, which would tell you that a mediator could be important, but even a mediator may not be the full and final solution. You need a number of things coming together. All right. Agnes also has a question. Agnes is asking, the topic of societal divides definitely brought some observation about the question of Palestine for the aspect of religious syncretisms and of Rwandan genocide. Absolutely. But I also thought about the episode of Roman history that has been reported by the historian Tito Livio. Let me just read this. Agrippa publicly addressed plebs to unite the population. What led to was preserving Roman mass isolating on a mountain. Can there be such a thing? This is also important as well. policy, especially when the culture is part of the equation. Absolutely. So Agnes, that's essentially the next part that we're going to be talking about. Yeah. All right. So Agnes, that's essentially the identity theory that we're going to be talking about, where, the ones that you've mentioned about, how does culture really play a role in this whole situation? So I'm just going to get to that, but feel free to ask for more clarifications when we get there. Okay, so society one. What is society one really saying? Society one is saying that imagine there are just three people completely dependent on each other. One knows how to catch a fish, okay, how to catch fish in general. The other knows how to light fire, and the third person knows how to cook. Okay, none of these three people can learn the skills of the other. They're just three people, and the only thing which is necessary for survival is eating fish. All right, that's the only resource for survival. Okay. Now, there are certain assumptions. As I said, the only thing available to eat is fish. Primary requirement for survival is just food. Uncooked food cannot be eaten. And let us also say that, you cannot really, they all desire equal portions of food, right? Now, my question over here is that, do you think there can be any exploitation in this particular society? It's a completely dependent, like it's a society with complete interdependence. Everybody relies on the others to survive. One person goes away and the whole society falls down. Do you think we can have discrimination in the society? And you can actually raise your hands. On your bottom panel, there'll be a reactions button, and you can raise your hands if you think we can have discrimination in a society like this. All right. So we have two people who think that we can have discrimination in society like this. Okay, let me quickly bring in Titli and Wayne, Titli and Wayne, to understand why you think there could be discrimination in a society like this.
Hi, Arpit.
Hi, Titli. So good to see you.
Same. Of course, I want to be an idealist as usual, but I feel like a lot of parts of our society are interdependent exactly like this. There are certain jobs, when you spoke of the caste system in India, that a certain caste, provides and nobody else would do it, but we still have discrimination. So
sure.
I don't know if just because the equation seems so cohesive that it would actually work idealistically, but that's my argument.
Okay, all right. Thank you. And Wayne? You're on mute, Wayne.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think the discrimination has a deeper root cause. And it's, as you stated before, it's related to power. It's more related to power, and where people basically feel that one has more than the other.
Sure.
And then the question would arise, why can that person do that and I cannot? So it doesn't only have to be based on culture or based on something else. It's a feeling that has a deeper root cause.
Absolutely. And all right, Sylvia, I'll come to you as well. Go for it.
So I was just going to say that my first bachelor's was on ethnic identity in groups, in smaller groups, and they were based on, they were all there in Romania. They have disappeared since this particular shepherds group.
Sure.
And they were doing transhumans, so they were taking the sheep from one part of the country all the way to the south, depending on the seasons. And because of this, I can say that I believe that it's very entrenched in the values that these groups, let's say they're not three different kind of people, but they're three different groups.
Sure.
And I think that values that are fundamental to their being and to their way of being are essential to whether a conflict would exist. If we go strictly by psychology and human nature, I'm convinced there will be a discrimination based on the fact that one of the groups believes that their work is more valuable than the work that somebody else has. For example, me making a fire is more difficult and requires more efforts, intellectual or otherwise, than you catching the fish or cooking the food itself.
Sure.
So I do agree with Wayne. It is a deeply embedded issue, but I am also like Sidley, I'm very idealistic, and I believe that there is a scope for creating those kind of values as long as we take out of the equation everything that's related to identity, such as religion, culture, and so on. The moment we take this all away and we realize we are the same, it wouldn't be a division based on anything else. But we won't get there too soon.
No, that's true, and that's what I'm gonna be concluding the lecture eventually. That no, it's a really hard nut to crack. But Sylvia, Wayne, and Titli, I take all three of your points, and I feel that a lot of your observations are valid for a real society. But if you're looking for this hypothetical society, let's say the person who's lighting the fire thinks that their job is most valuable, and the other two, they want to gang up against this person, they would still not do that, because if this person is gone, then their survival just goes for a toss. All right. So this is sort of a hypothetical perfect society of interdependence. And that's the reason why I only kept one person in the society. When you have multiple people, you could trade favors with a few and discriminate against the others. Okay. And obviously the cultural aspect is always there, but there are exactly three people in the society. So in this ideal society of perfect dependence, we would not be able to have any discrimination which can be executed. But the point being that there are no ideal societies. Okay, so that's one extreme of the ideal. I see Chitresh's hand up, and Chitresh is a senior fellow at Global Policy Insight. So I'm going to let Chitresh chime in over here very quickly.
Thank you so much, sir. Just a quick comment on, as you said, that everybody feels that their job is important. This is something that I have been seeing in academia as well. So we have college professors, we have the university professors, we have the lecturers, and we have the teachers. So, we always feel that the professors are superior. And then below that, we don't usually pay much attention to, say, lecturers or even school teachers.
Absolutely. But the reason why that's happening is that there's no perfect dependence. A professor can work absolutely, not absolutely, but to a large extent without the help of a lecturer. So that's the thing. You can have discrimination within the same profession for sure. But over here, that just three people. All right. So this is a society of perfect dependence. And then this other society, society 2, is a society of perfect independence. And you cannot have exploitation even in these. And this is a society where there are just three people completely independent of each other. All of them know how to catch fish, make a fire, and cook fish. These are the only three relevant activities for them. The fish is abundant and easy to catch. The material available to make fire and to cook is readily available, and it's abundant. It's costless to acquire. So this is a completely independent society where no person really depends on the other. And here again, you would really not find discrimination. Now, the thing is that the real societies, they fall between these two extremes. All right. You don't find real societies which are, and I'm still talking about realistic conflict theory over here. So you would not really be able to find real societies which are at these two extremes. So there's a lot of interest-based bargaining that, falls between these two. All right. Now, personal / professional lesson for that is that, the more critical a person's profession or skills is, the more scarce that skills is, that set of skill is, and the less replaceable that is, the lesser they'll be prone to any sort of, at least, economic exploitation, right? That's a side for people who are looking for career advice, right? Okay, the other set of theory are the primordialists, and there, I feel that what Titli, Sylvia, and Wayne talked about, this is, the group that's talking about these things, which is that, our identities are so entrenched. Our identities are, just something that we learn as we are growing through rituals, symbols, and customs from birth to death, that we start forming in-groups and out-groups based on those identity markers from the time that we are born. And our mind is trained not to go against the larger opinion of our group. And that's called a phenomena called groupthink, which essentially means that we try to conform to the values of our and the opinions and decisions of our group. We rationalize their decisions, even if they're bad. And we pay a psychological cost if we are publicly disagreeing with what the larger group or what the majority of the group thinks, because earlier times, our tribal neuroscience is developed, our tribal neural networks have developed in a manner that if you did not really stand with the group, then you stood to be attacked or to be killed or to be harmed by the rest of the group. So we pay a psychological cost of not complying with our group members. And that's how we start, on the journey of discrimination. All right. Now, a lot of this work is done, seminal work by Henry Tajfel, and he conducted some of these experiments where he would literally show these, dots to people on the screen, and he'd probably show you the dots. Let's say he'll bring Sylvia into a room, show these dots on a screen, and then, take Sylvia out of the room, and he'd ask Sylvia, how many dots did you see on the screen? And let's say Sylvia, give us a number. How many dots did you see on the screen?
35.
35. All right. So now he might just tell Sylvia that, hey, actually, there were just 30 dots in here. So you overestimated the dots. And you did that because psychologically, it's all made up. All right. So he'll tell you that psychologically, you're a dot overestimator. All right. And dot overestimators, they tend to have a particular personality type, a particular sort of upbringing, etc., etc. All right. And then brings in Titli. And Titli, let's say, Titli, how many dots do you see over there?
I'm guessing I'm going to underestimate, so 20.
Okay, so let's say Titli is an underestimator, and then I make Titli sit in another room, which is the dot underestimators room. And then I bring in Chitresh, and Chitresh says that, there were again 40 dots, let's say. So I put Chitresh in the same room as Sylvia, and then I bring Wayne, and Wayne, let's say, says there are 15 dots, and I say that, okay, Wayne, you're an underestimator, so you go in the same room as Titli. Now I convinced these two groups that dot underestimators are alike in terms of personalities and dot overestimators are different in terms of personalities. So if you belong to a particular group, there's a lot of uniformity in personality types and other preferences in general upbringing that you'll find in common with your own group, but contrasting with the other group members. And then I would invite you guys to play a little game. And that particular game would be that essentially what's going to happen in that game is that you play one round, you get some money, and then you're asked to leave. And when you're leaving, you can either give that money. So you'd get, let's say, $10. You can do three things with those $10. Either you give $5 to somebody in your in-group, okay? Or you pay $5 to somebody in your out-group. So, divide it equally between the two groups. That's option one. Option two is give all of the $10 to a person in your in-group and nothing to the person in your out-group. Option 3 is give all of your money to a person in your outgroup. All right. And he found that most of the people gave most of their money to a person belonging to their in-group, even though these groups were absolutely arbitrarily formed. And he replicated these experiments by not just categorizing people as dot underestimators or overestimators, but also as lovers of Klee or Kandinsky, in terms of arts. So he'd show you those paintings and ask you that which one did you like better, etc., etc. All right. And a lot of times, these experiments have been replicated with fake paintings as well, from not really from the artists. So what Tajfel really realized that identities can really form based on anything, as arbitrary as how many dots do you see. And what you also recommend, the policy recommendations that come from this perspective are usually of two categories. Number one is that you remove all of the identities. Okay, so you don't talk about. So that's somewhat probably less formally what Marx was also talking about, or Engels was also talking about, that you create a classless, stateless society, a person without any identity markers. And I don't think those recommendations really work, that you cannot really get people rid of all of the identities that they carry in. That's the reason why we had uniforms in school. That's the reason why we have uniforms in, some factories. Okay. The other view is the reformist view. And within that, there are two streams. One is the common identity approach. No, reformist views, yeah. So that is the common identity approach, which essentially says that, okay, let's create a superordinate identity, which is that, okay, we are all Asians, we are all Americans. We are not black or white or Texan or, a New Yorker. We are all Americans. So that's one way. And the other actually is the unity in diversity approach, that, okay, we have our differences, but let's celebrate our differences instead of, thinking that, there's something to be discriminated against. Sylvia. Are you able to unmute?
Yeah, this in-group, out-group concept goes very deep. I have been dealing with it because I study animal behavior, welfare, and conservation, and I'm graduating.
Awesome.
And therefore, thank you. And with animals, it goes even deeper, because it's very clear, or for humans, to just attribute this inferiority based on God knows what. But a very interesting thing, and this is where I was leading with my project last year, my specialist research project. If you create these superordinates, you have to be very careful whom you compare to whom. Because with the animals, if you compare animals to humans, then there is a positive, there is an increase in a positive feeling towards animals. Whereas when they compared humans to animals, because of the animals are still considered beasts, and of course they reproduce and they're dirty and they do things that us humans find as inferior, and we would not do that. We are not beasts. Therefore, when they compare humans to animals, automatically the attitude towards animals became negative. So you have to be very, very fine and delicate with what you create in terms of we're all the same, but which is how do we compare and whom do we compare to whom? Because also very discriminated groups, especially ethnic groups, are being compared to roaches, or they are beasts and they deserve to be lynched and so on. So we have to be very careful what kind of aspects and characteristics we choose to compare or create this common thread with, because they might have the exactly opposite effect than what we intend to create.
Absolutely. Those are really great, nuanced and insightful observations, Sylvia. And in fact, if you are going to be part of this fellowship, I think a person that you should certainly interact with is Jill Robinson, who will be coming in as a mentor, and she is heading Animals Asia, and I am sure that she would be blown away by your research. Okay, so the third group of researchers, that's the mixed approach, and they say that it's an interaction of real interests with, these identity factors. And they say that it's a progression. One of my favorite applications of this research is on individual leaders who would earlier be, secular, and they would talk about Hindu-Muslim unity in India. In fact, there's a great case study written on Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who used to be a great advocate of religion-less politics, so religion-free politics, and later on, became a radical, Islamic sort of a leader. Even though, radical for those times, not probably as radical as people could be now. Okay, so what this particular theory tells us is that you have first group formation based usually on different identity markers. So it's starting with the dot underestimator, overestimator sort of a thing. And when I realize as a person that this other person is also in my own group, I make assumption number one, that not only do we share a particular identity, we also share all of our economic as well as extra economic interests. So we not just have common identity, we also have common interests. So if I am belonging to a particular caste, and let's say somebody else is also belonging to a particular caste, then our interests are very much common and aligned. Okay. The stage two is when I see the other. I see a person who does not belong to this particular group, has a different identity, and I consider that this other group or a member of this other group is distinct in all spheres of life, not just on that identity marker, but they have different economic, political, and other aspirations and interests. So it's the assumption of common interests with your in-group and the assumption of different interests with your out-group, contrasting interests with your out-group. And it's a slippery slope. By the time you realize that, you've slipped into stage three, which is that not only do you assume that a person in the out-group has different interests, you start assuming that their interests are antithetical to yours. Okay, so their interests compete with your interests. They're not just different. All right. So you sort of fall into that zero-sum thinking with them. And it's easy to slip from stage one to stage two to stage three. And it's an interaction between interests and identities. And, then you're sort of, you've fallen into that loop, or, game theoretically, you've fallen into that prisoner's dilemma where, your game, both of you are just going against each other. Both of you are playing the defect game against each other. So that's, you're sort of stuck in that loop. And then the biases, they fuel conflict, and the conflict fuels the biases. You're stuck in that. All right. Now, the thing is that, broadly, there are three recommendations that have come up. The three recommendations are over, people who have studied these various theories. One has been the contact hypothesis, that says that you increase contact, you increase, let's say, trade, you increase interactions. In fact, Ashutosh Varshney on communal violence in India has talked about places such as sports centers, public parks, gymnasiums, where people leave behind their identities at home and they interact over there. So that sort of increases greater bonhomie between people. So that certainly has some validity, but also we need to remember that it's a necessary but insufficient condition, greater contact. And when greater contact happens, when there are antithetical perceived interests, then that could actually lead to greater conflict rather than reduced conflict. Okay, so contact is important, but that's not the whole of the story. The other is common goals. We have discussed that common goals are certainly important, but we also saw that common goals, they're hard to come by, and you need to have common goals where you need both of the groups to act. And, without any of the groups acting, nothing is going to happen. So a lot of times common enemy becomes that common goal, but there are several challenges. A lot of times, even if there's a common enemy, there is no real guarantee. If you've seen the movie, what was that called? Was that, yeah, Don't Look Up, where the common goal was definitely there. It was climate change. It was all of these meteors, etc., hitting, but the various groups were not able to coordinate, and eventually, that's what happened. That's what's happening with the whole environmental thing, right? We have a common goal. It's a superordinate common goal, but we're not able to act on it because there's a lot of coordination problems. Similarly, there's another thing that maybe a common goal unites, but then when the job is done, when the common enemy is won over, then people start just fighting. The two groups start fighting amongst each other again. And the third bit is common identities, but that also has limits. You have seen people in the same family to siblings in an internecine conflict about properties, or you have seen people belonging to the same community committing crimes against each other, which means that just common identities without common goals and enough contact, it doesn't work. So essentially our policy recommendation, and this is again just a foundation to start with, this is not a whole theory, whole story, because there are many nuances over there, but our policy recommendations is that you have 3 necessary but insufficient conditions if you want to bridge intergroup conflict. You need common goals, you need common identities, and you need the 2 groups to be in contact with each other in neutral settings. And these are the 3 C's that we have as foundational infrastructure to bridge intergroup conflicts. I think we are up with our time. I might be able to take a couple of questions before, before I hand it over to Eeshan, who's going to be talking to you about global commons. All right, so if we have, I'm happy to take a couple of questions if there are any, or otherwise I'm also sending in my email address and then my LinkedIn link if you want to reach out. And if you want to, typically I club game theory, I club a lot of, systems thinking when I'm talking about these as part of the comparative public administration course that I offer at the GPODS Fellowship. So if you're interested in learning more about this stuff, do check out our website and do apply for our fellowship program, which lasts for 3 months. It's completely online. And it's designed in a way that working professionals can still manage. So consider applying for that. And let me just quickly take Titli's question over here, talking about Jinnah. A great book that comes to mind is Nehru, The Debates That Defined India. Absolutely, a brilliant book. In fact, I was reading another book on Pranav Mukherjee, which had a reference to this one. All right. Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. And I'm going to be dropping in my LinkedIn coordinate in a while, but I hand it over to Eeshan now. Thank you.
All right. I always feel like that's some heavy duty stuff following a lecture. Hi, guys. Session that we're now conducting on global commons and circularity. The idea behind the session is to introduce to you the concept of circularity, circular economy, how it works in real life. What we do typically is that we aim to become professionals in a particular thing without understanding the basics of it. So if any of you are concerned about the environment or want to know more about circularity, that's what we'll be doing in this session. The runtime of the session typically is 60 minutes. We have a panel discussion with the ambassador in about 45 minutes. So we'll try and give you guys a break of 5 minutes before we start the next session. If that is possible, I'm not as infamous to go over my running time as Arpit is, so I'll try and finish it within 65 to 70 minutes. All right. So that's what we'll be discussing. It's nice to see known faces. Hi, Chitresh. Hi, Titli. Hi, Sylvia. I think we met in one of the past sessions. So yes, let's begin. And let me see if, yeah. So that's what we'll be discussing. The way I deal with circular economy is by connecting the dots. So there might be times where things that I'm talking about do not make sense to you. I assure you that they will eventually, hopefully, uh, and then we'll read through the context of circular economy through those things that we discussed. All right. Can anyone think of a city that has an air quality index of less than 50? You could write your answers in the chat box. You could raise your hands, whatever you like. I'm talking about a city that is absolutely not polluted. So air quality index that's less than 50. You give it a couple of seconds. All right. All right. Well, you guys have better examples than I have, because what I have for you is the city of Berlin. And we associate so many things with Berlin. We do not really reflect upon the fact that Berlin has an average AQI for the whole year of less than 40 per annum. Okay. Now, less than 40 is very clean air, right? Now, if some of you have been to Shanghai, Beijing, somehow you're very old and you've been to LA in 1960s, or if you're very, very old and you'd been to London in 1902 or 1905, you'd know that this is an absolute luxury. If some of you, like myself, live in New Delhi, then you'd know that the air quality in New Delhi is tremendously bad. Every year we have the season of pollution, like monsoons and summers and spring. We have a typical season of pollution that lasts for about 2 months in November and December in New Delhi, and the whole city is covered in smog. It's very difficult to have any sort of visibility beyond 10-15 meters during those months. What people do not consider is that while those 2 months are what are, flashpoints and all the news articles and everything, even on rest of the time of the year, Delhi has an incredibly poor air quality. 300 is what we're looking at in terms of air quality annually. Now, compare that to a Berlin or the examples that we have in the chat box, and you realize that this is a ticking time bomb, right? All right, so that was my introduction to circularity. Now we're just going to move on to things that will make better sense to you. But continuing the thought that this is a very disconnected lecture and will all come together a little later, I have another question that is absolutely disconnected. Has anyone heard of biomimicry? The concept of biomimicry? All right, I'm assuming people have heard of it. Even if you haven't, I'll explain it to you, so it should not take time. But biomimicry is basically a concept where technological impetus is given on learning from nature, how things are designed in nature, and you take that concept and you put it in industrial design, you put it in nanotechnology, other forms of technology, and that's how you come up with the idea that you can build better things if you learn from nature itself. And there are various ways of in how biomimicry has made a difference. There is the whole example of humpback whales. There's this whole example of down feather coats that are now designed to keep you warmer instead of having regular fur coats. Down feather coats are supposed to be more effective. And then you have probably the most talked about example, which is that of bullet trains coming into the picture. And bullet trains are typically designed on the basis of the way a hummingbird is structured in nature. So the aerodynamic nature of the bullet train is inspired from those of hummingbirds. Now there is differentiation and arguments as to whether it's hummingbird or kingfisher, but the logic remains the same. Biomimicry is when you take ideas of nature and implement those to make your industrial design or your design imperative more effective. The reason why I'm discussing these two things of Berlin and Delhi and then biomimicry in one breath almost is because biomimicry has been sort of like the stepchild of environmentalism, right? Because environmental science and environmental tech and environmental design and law and policy are all different paradigms because they come under different subsets of specializations. So biomimicry then is hidden between somewhere between design engineering and mechanical design. Over the past 2 years, when a lot of us have suffered due to the pandemic, and we've also seen the whole world transition onto their laptops and onto Zoom and MS Teams and WebEx, we've sort of also realized how globalization has made it easier for people to cope with the social distancing and distancing norms that are in place. But from the context of biomimicry, globalization is not a new thing. Because when you talk of globalization, there's the most intricate part of humanity, of planet Earth, that has never really been divided amongst countries. And that's where environment comes into the picture. So if you think of environment from the point of view of biomimicry, reverse biomimicry has happened in the sense that nature has been now divided into boundaries and environment has been now legislated upon according to the borders and geographies of that particular state. And that's what we will be addressing in this session. So if globalization is something that we have picked up as a civilization over the past 20 years and more so over the past 2 years, environment has been globalized over the past millennia or so, actually, since time immemorial. So air, typically, if I take the example of Berlin and New Delhi, while the local spots of Berlin and local spots of Delhi and local spots of various cities around the globe might have an AQI that might differ, eventually this is all, the atmosphere is all a melting pot of cumulative air quality indices coming together and forming our atmosphere, right? And that's why in terms of international environmental policy, there's this concept of leakage, Leakage. It is also called international environmental leakage, where the whole idea is that you can never have policies to curb pollution within your system without economically impacting your own system. I'll explain how this works. So let's say that there's a state, a nation state called state X. And there's a neighboring state, a nation state called state Y. State X is very rich, state Y not as much. And state X decides that there's way too much pollution happening within our borders. So let's cut down on our industry emissions and let's raise our standards of emissions. So what state X does is it cuts all the emissions, permissible emissions, in half. So now no industry can pollute more than half of what it was polluting earlier. Okay. What that eventually does is in 5 to 10 years time, the air of state X cleans up, there's a better standard of living, people can breathe better, People have better physical health, mental health, all the things that come with polluted air. However, remember state Y, the neighboring state of state X? State Y wasn't as rich as state X. And state Y sees this as an opportunity. State Y says that, listen, there are industries that are not being able to maximize their profits, or their profits have really gone down because state X has curbed its environmental emissions, right? So it has puts more stringent, stricter environmental standards, because of which industries are not able to maximize their profits. And when this is happening, state Y says that let's make our environmental standards even more lax to invite all of these industries from state X to state Y, right? So all of these industries just move base from state X to state Y or state Z, any other state around this country. And they keep on polluting because now state Y wants that investment, wants that development, and it has slashed its environmental standards. When all this industry moves, state X still has the cleaner air, but not as much economic development. State Y has an incredibly bad air quality, but a lot of industrial development. So state Y eventually becomes economically prosperous, while state X, which has cleaner air, its economical development goes down. Economic development goes down. Now, the gain here is that state X lost its industry, state Y gained that industry, state X for a short amount of time had better air, state Y has worse air. However, because environment is typically a global commodity, if at all, the pollution from state Y, from neighboring states, eventually transfers to state X, right? So while over the next 2 to 3 years, state X might be better equipped in terms of air quality, eventually the air quality goes down because state Y, state Z, all the states around state X lead to a higher air quality index in state X as well. Now, if you think that this is a theoretical concept, I invite you to look up what's happening with California's pollution. Historically, a lot of pollution happens over the Pacific. So pollution transfers over the Pacific Ocean and goes to the shores of California. It's happening in cities, it's happening in states and provinces, it's happening in nations as well. The pollution of a nation eventually hampers the neighboring states, hampers states around you as well. So the first thing we need to understand is that to understand environment, you have to understand that there's an intrinsic global aspect to environment. Under the concept of international environmental leakage, you have to consider what global precedents are in that scenario. And that's why you'll see a lot of people at these conference or parties that happen every year agitate that one person doing something would not make as much of a difference because of international environmental leakage. That theoretical concept that I might cut my emissions down to zero and I might become net zero by tomorrow, but if you keep on polluting and you're my neighbor, all of my efforts would go in vain. Because again, environment does not follow borders. Environment is not restricted by borders. So if it is an inherently global concept, then what can you do about it? Now, before I go ahead with aspects of circular economy, I want us to address an urban policy issue more than anything. And that is a realization that I'm sure all of us know of, but probably not have not given it as much thought. The realization that the rural parts of our country, our respective countries, the villages and towns barely do anything bad for the environment in comparative terms. If you want statistics, about 55% of the world's population lives in urban areas. 68% is what it is expected to be in the next 30 years. So you're talking of a handful of cities, in every country that's habitating almost half of the world's population, more than half of the world's population, that is going on to 2/3 of the world's population, right? So you have these centers, these pockets of incredible density of people staying in a particular place. And when, like everything, so let me draw an analogy here. You throw a party and you're expecting 10 people and no one turns up because there's a festival, because they're not really your friends and whatever. But the point of the matter is that if you go on to finish all the 10 pizzas you ordered for all of your guests, that creates inefficiency, right? And that's what's happening in terms of global centers, these urban centers. If you're thinking of populating 1/10, 1/20th of the world's landmass with 2/3 of the world's population, the carrying capacity of the land might not be able to take it, right? Now, as I say in the slide, all of these urban centers, these handful of urban centers in your country, in my country, basically consume almost 3/4, 80% of the world's energy and produce more than around 2/3 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So let me put all of these things in perspective. These handful of cities in your country house most of the people in your country, contribute to most of the energy consumption in your country, very, very inefficient energy consumption in your country. That also makes it inequitable and unjust, things that are very inherently related to environment, equity and justice, and produce a lot more waste, produce a lot more greenhouse gas emissions. And that's what we're trying to understand. So in one of the recent interviews, I was recently interviewed by a bunch of people and they were asking about circular economy. And they asked me to explain the whole concept in 2 minutes. And I will tell you that concept in the 2 minutes that I had, the way I told to that group. If you guys promise me that you're not going to leave this lecture after 2 minutes understanding circular economy in the whole sense. But circular economy it works this way. If I were to ask you to name a couple of shapes, you'll probably say circle because that's what we're talking about, or square, maybe a rectangle. But the most basic shape we are taught is a line, right? The first thing that a child learns to draw is a line, right? Connecting a dot with another dot. And that's a line. And I don't know about each of your artistic abilities, but I haven't really mastered a perfect circle freehand still. So for the first 10, 15 years, when you're working on your handwriting, when you're working on your writing skills, when you're working on presentation of your writing, you're only working on lines and making lines better and smoother and better curves and such. Very few of us ever concentrate on drawing that perfect circle unless you're in the artistic industry. And once you get to drawing that perfect circle, you realize how much more difficult it is to draw that perfect circle without aid of tools. And circular economy or linear economy works in the same way. Since the advent of human civilization, irrespective of what people tell you, bartership has been now known to be a myth. It was never really a market practice. Human beings have always stuck to that line, perfecting that line, right? Perfecting how you connect A dot to B dot and not think about what's happening after the B dot. And now this concept of circularity is supposed to come in and it's going to teach human civilization how to draw the perfect circle. So for anyone who tells you that circular economy or circularity is something we're going to achieve in the next 2 years, 3 years. It's not going to happen, because can you teach yourself how to draw the perfect circle freehand in the next 5 minutes? That's same time scale for human civilization in terms of years. So first of all, circular economy is going to take time. It's not going to happen tomorrow or the next year or the year after. The second thing is, linear economy is so ingrained in our systems, the way we perceive things, the way we think about circularity even, that redesigning our mental systems to understand how environment is working in that sphere becomes very difficult. So let me explain how we work as a society today, as a global population today. Linear economy can be very well understood with the phrase take, make, consume, throw away. There are versions of this phrase that you'll hear very often if you're trying to understand how linear economy works. But the point that is being made is that you take something. Typically, those are natural resources extracted from the earth. You make something with those natural resources, raw materials. You consume those resources, and eventually you discard those resources. The last stage usually involves production of waste, which is a separate issue altogether. Hopefully, we'll have time to discuss that as well. But that's the linear economy version. So you take something, it goes into your economy, you come up with a value added product from those raw materials, you consume that product, and you eventually discard that product, right? If some of us have followed any environmentally conscious organization, store, you would have heard recycle, reuse, and what is the third thing? Reuse, recycle, renew, whatever it is. This session will make clear that those three things are very inapt to achieve circular economy. So we have been given the wrong picture all through, and we'll get to that. But linear economy, hence, typically includes an assumption that we have infinite resources. So we extract those resources, we produce using those resources, we distribute those products, consume those products, and eventually dispose of whatever we have left. And once you've gone through the cycle, that's the end of the road. So that little child has reached point B, drawn a line, and you move on again, extracting infinite resources, extracting more resources, producing more products, distributing those, consuming those, and disposing those off. Now, there are two assumptions for linear economy to work very well, and it could if those two assumptions were true. And those two assumptions are on the two sides of this graphical representation. It would have worked very well if we had infinite resources, and it would have worked very well if we had a planet that was regenerating these resources at a pace greater than pace at which we're using these resources. Now, unfortunately, these are both assumptions, right? These are both assumptions that cannot really work out in any multiverse of this planet. Sorry, I'm very pop culture savvy. Yes, it is reduce. You're right. It was reduce, reuse, recycle, right? So that's the linear economy version. So why is it such a bad thing? One is that you're utilizing all the resources that you're extracting from the earth, and then you're wasting those eventually because you're not getting something out of those after they're wasted, right? So one thing is that you're depleting Earth's natural resources. I understand that. We can live with that, right? Like what if we use all of the Earth's natural resources and extract all of the minerals and metals underneath us? That's absolutely okay. I'm sure we'll figure something out technologically to sustain ourselves. The issue is not just the fact that there are finite resources and finite regenerative capacity of Earth. The issue is actually what's happening during this line that we're drawing. So during the time of extraction, you're clearing forests, you're damaging biodiversity, you're also causing scarcity of whatever you are mining, because nothing is in abundance in terms of fossil fuels and mines and minerals. In terms of production, when you're using that raw material, you're then using water, you're using carbon dioxide, you're using a lot of other gases that are required for value added services that go into a product, from raw material to a product. Then you're utilizing those products. So we know that there are carbon dioxide emissions, there are sulfur dioxide emissions, there are nitrogen emissions, there are greenhouse gas emissions generally, and then there are microplastics, there are pesticides, insecticides, so many things that go into the ground in our atmosphere, right? So it's not just the finite resources and finite regenerative capacity of Earth that we're looking at when we're looking at linear economy. It's also everything that goes on between point A and point B. So raw material scarcity, biodiversity destruction, clearing forests, clearing natural habitats, upsetting the food chain, upsetting the ecosystem, reducing the ecosystem services, whether that's cultural services or provisioning services, water pollution and all other kinds of pollutions, microplastics and emissions of greenhouse gases, and eventually waste, right? Everything is waste eventually. And that's the sad bit. And that's what circular economy tries to curb as a concept. So if you're looking at it in these terms, think of our local communities, our state governments, provincial governments, national governments, plans for waste management. Apart from the odd recycling or the odd refurbishing, you get a lot of stress on this thing called landfills. Okay, everyone's heard of it. Landfill is typically a demarcated portion of land which ideally should be covered by certain elements of lining on the land, and then you typically dump all of the waste in this landfill. Okay, and in India, you have examples of landfills being taller than what India used to be most famous for, which is the Taj Mahal. But now we have landfills that are higher than some of the tombs of Taj Mahal itself. What happens in these landfills is you might think that, listen, if I come to power, like any cool student council secretary, you'll say that, listen, I'll fix all of this. The problem with landfills is that you cannot just tomorrow come and clear all of that waste that is generated. In such landfills, a typical element that is produced, because of all of this waste being there for a long time, is called a leachate, Leachate. And this element is almost financially impossible to fix. It cannot be cleaned ever. And because it's in liquid form, it eventually goes into your groundwater and contaminates all of the groundwater table. In some cases, aquifers altogether have been contaminated. So you're talking about a linear economy that is causing waste, that is causing emissions, that is causing pollution of all kinds, that is destroying biodiversity, clearing forest, and doing all of this when there's just enough raw materials left in our planet, right? And even if there are just enough raw materials left in our planet, there is hardly any regenerative capacity left of Earth. Now, there are two things that happen in this case. One is that you're finishing whatever is left in terms of tangibles, of raw materials, of mines, minerals. And then there are intangibles of air, of better health quality, all the impacts that poor air, poor water, poor atmospheric quality have on you. So how do you curb this issue? How do you somehow fix this linearity of our economies? And that's what circular economy tries to do. Now, before I begin with the core concept of circular economy, let me also tell you that I think that a perfectly circular economy is a myth. I think that it is impossible to have a perfectly circular economy. And that is because you have to count in human errors, you have to count in uh, impasses, diplomatic or negotiative impasses where people just disagree on aspects of circular economy, and hence you're having minimal waste and zero waste, and that minimal waste then leads to a non-circular economy. But why do I say that? Circular economy, by definition, is a concept that does not start at this stage. It is a concept that starts at this stage. It starts at a stage where you start saying, let's refurbish a particular thing, let's reuse a particular thing, let's share a particular thing. If you have been to some countries, I mean, there are some countries that say that we'll allow certain cars in this fast moving lane if you have a carpooling pass. So if you have a carpooling pass and you're sharing your transportation with others, you can go in the fast lane, or else you're going in the regular lanes, right? In the same countries, you don't just have that fast lane for carpooling cars, you also have that fast lane for electric vehicles. That's another story altogether. But typically, it includes sharing, leasing, reuse, repair, refurbishment, and recycling, as we understood. But it also has a concept of refusing. And that is very often not talked about. The idea to say no to things that you do not require. So the most important challenge of human society is, I think, learning to say no to things that you do not need. And that means that you're now not just dealing with the economy, but in fact dealing with the most complicated set of dynamic actors, which is you and me. So you're now talking about behavioral economics and behavioral psychology. So how do you get people to refuse and then get them to reuse, recycle, and such things? The other thing is, strictly in terms of biomimicry still, everything in nature follows a circular shape. So whether that's a food chain that you might have seen as a young kid, or it's the water cycle, so water in a lake going up in the atmosphere, coming down as rain, precipitation, that's a water cycle. Nature is extremely circular, right? And biomimicry, that topic still continuing. Circular economy aims to be a closed loop, like a food cycle, like a water cycle. And a closed loop circular economy is the perfect kind of circular economy. But how does this really work in real life? If you've ever traveled backpacking across Europe or elsewhere and stayed in cheap hostels, you would have seen these bookshelves everywhere. And the whole idea behind these bookshelves is that you pick up a book, you drop a book, you don't have to buy new books. You can just replace the book that you already have with the book that you wish to read or you've already read. And that's about it, right? Now, if you think about the concept, perhaps this thing was started with, say, 5 books. And one of these signs was put up that there's a book exchange happening in this hostel. Whenever you come, you can take a book, you can drop a book, and such. So there is no new edition of books. People come and people go, and the bookshelf itself keeps replenishing itself, right? So that's the idea behind a very, very small example of circular economy. And you might say that this is, a one-off example. How can this work out in real life? Could there be other examples? Yes, there are other examples. Depending on your vintage. When I was younger, we used to have the glass bottles of Coca-Cola, right? So you used to finish your bottle, you used to give back the bottle to the shopkeeper and move on with your life. We did not have plastic bottles. And if you typically broke the bottle or you did not give back the bottle, the store or the shopkeeper used to basically charge you for breaking that bottle, right? Could be 50 cents, it could be 2 rupees, whatever. Yes, Sylvia, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just going to add after you were talking. I was brought up in such a community, and also in my Eastern European community, the street where we lived on, everyone had their households and animals and growing potatoes and all the vegetables possible and fruits. And one of the things that we used to do was just to exchange. So if you had surplus produce, whether there were apples and you were having honey or jam or whatever, people used to just trade between them. There wasn't necessarily a value attributed to the produce itself,
Right.
because otherwise, again, you can just very artificially inflate the value of each produce. However, this was going on really well, and there were people who were quite good at cutting grass, because it never used to be done with a machine. It used to be done manually. Therefore, they used to come and work in your garden and do that, and then you would do something else for them. And this worked out really well and it actually brought the community closer, because there was no competition per se, and whatever competition and surplus was just exchanged, and everyone had everything.
And you're saying that these were community gardens that everyone used as
No, each had their own gardens, but then people were getting together and just discussing. And I'm sorry, I know a lot of people are vegan and I don't eat meat anymore, but there were people who had experience in sacrificing animals. I know it sounds like a religious ritual, but we always call it sacrificing, because there is an asking for forgiveness, because you take the life of an animal to suit your needs. Therefore, we call it sacrificing.
Right.
So they used to lend their trade to you, and then you would lend your own trade. And it was always this very constructive
circular, right,
exchange between people, and it just brought people together rather than just pushing them away.
Yes, absolutely. So there's also a sociological element to what Sylvia is saying, and we'll try to cover that as well. But so going back to, so you now you know that what I'm saying is I'm not making it up. Now Sylvia has sort of vouched for what I'm saying, and these things do exist. In terms of that Coca-Cola bottle that I was talking about, if you broke that bottle, or if you dropped that bottle, you had to pay for replenishing that bottle, which meant that there was a negative incentive for you to steal that bottle, take away that bottle, break that bottle. You handle it with care, and there was a massive incentive for Coca-Cola to keep on using those glass bottles, because in an ideal world, you have 100 glass bottles that are being used and then given back and being washed and dried and then being bottled again. And you have no more cost capital investment in terms of new bottles, right? You're just reusing those bottles. I know that this is a hypothetical because, with the growth of Coca-Cola and the demand of Coca-Cola, they probably have to make 1 million bottles every day. But the fact of the matter remains that if there were 100 bottles already in the market, 99 or 95 of them would continue in the market 5 years later as well. Now, there was an incentive for the consumer to return that bottle, and there was an incentive for the producer to have that bottle back, because now the producer is not spending on new bottles. If you want recent examples, you could listen to Thrift Shop. It's a wonderful song. Now, circular economy typically has a natural capital element to it, a social capital element to it, human capital, and capital of economy, of markets as well, right? So when you have to then come up with a solution to bringing about circular economy, you're thinking of reinventing each of these capitals and are thinking. That's why I said that the most difficult thing to control is behavior and behavioral economics and psychology of your consumers, of you and me. So typically there could be biological elements to it, which are the easier ones. So you're thinking of living beings that could be decomposed. You're thinking of kitchen waste and such things. And then there are technical materials, the more difficult topic to understand through circular economy. So if I am using an iPod, it's topical because it was just discontinued. If I'm using an iPod, and if I've used it for 5 to 6 years, what do I do with it, right? What could I do with it? How could I bring it within the circular economy domain? Well, according to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, there are two biological and technical aspects to circular economy. And biological is simpler, as you would understand. There's decomposition. It all comes back to the circle of environment. This figure on the right-hand side of your screens is the more difficult one. And let's take that iPod example and start with it. You have finite materials. You have an X amount of aluminium, copper, bronze, whatever is used in an iPod. And you make an iPod with all of those materials, right? You manufacture the parts, and then you manufacture the products, and then you provide services, and then eventually it goes to the user. Now, under a typical circular economy model, you would have a user using that iPod for 5 years, and then giving it to a friend, giving it to a cousin, giving it to a brother, giving it to a relative, right? And by that logic, you're extending the life cycle of that product. So the first step in circular economy is extending any product's life cycle. So from 5 years, it becomes 7 years. From 7 years, there might be further hand-me-downs, it becomes 9 years, and your cousin's friend's friend might give it to some other friend, and the life cycle of that iPod is absolutely stretched to a point where it could not go any further, right? So you've now come to reuse and redistribute. Let's say that that person who cannot use it anymore because the buttons have stopped working does not throw it away. Instead, it takes it to the shop that will fix the iPod buttons for him, and the iPod is working again. So you now refurbish that product in order to increase its life cycle further. Okay. So now you've gone to 10, 15 years of using that iPod. Now it's uncool to carry iPods and you want to do away with it. What do you do in an integrated loop of circular economy? In an integrated loop of circular economy, the end of the life cycle of a product would mean that you strip that product to its absolute bare minimum. So you're coming with a handful of copper and a handful of aluminium and a bunch of other products that are used, raw materials that are used in manufacturing iPods, and you give it back to the manufacturing industries, right? So circular economy could be an open loop circular economy, which is an imperfect circular economy, or an integrated or a closed loop circular economy. Now, the perfect circular economy, the closed loop, integrated loop circular economy, has zero waste, which means that everything that goes into the loop keeps on being used in the loop itself, right? It is never ever wasted. It is never ever discarded. There are no externalities of that particular product being used. Now, when we look at other sorts of economies, you'll realize that no economy can function in a way that there's no human error, that there's no waste. But that's why it is said, or I argue, that circular economy in its complete perfect way might be a myth, typically. The other thing is that you need to have an industry, a market, an economic structure where there are provisions for each of these aspects. So there is a provision for sharing, there is a provision for maintaining, prolonging the life cycle and refurbishing, reusing, remanufacturing, and eventually all of those things are stripped to their basics and minimums and then reused in the industrial cycle altogether. So you're looking at very, very skilled aspects of economy, of market systems, where you have labor that can do all of these aspects at different stages of a product's life cycle. Now, there are certain aspects to this that are probably not agreeable to you or to me or to the industries. And that is, one, we have been conditioned to think of second-hand products as, not your primary choice, right? And typically circular economy is all about hand-me-downs and second-hands, right? So that's one aspect. The second aspect is, imagine a big chunk of your economy, a big, big, big chunk of where the capital is. That big chunk is employed in either mining, that big chunk is employed in using new resources altogether, adding services to those raw materials that are extracted from the industry, from the planet. So now you're looking at a big void that is created for people who are dependent on these things. And I often take the example of gas stations. So what happens is, and a lot of us might not relate to this, but if you've traveled in the developing world, if you traveled in Asia especially, unlike the West, you do not have self-fuel gas stations, right? So you go to a gas station in the West, you take the pump, you pump your car and you pay for it and you leave, right? In Asia, typically Southeast Asia, you have manual gas stations, which means that there are personnel who are employed at these gas stations who fill your car's tank. Now think of it in an EV transition case. In the global South, now that the EV infrastructure that's coming about is all self-charging EV. You do not need any personnel to charge your electric vehicles. What that means is that if in the next 10 years, an India or Sri Lanka or Bangladesh or any of the South Asian countries, transition completely to electrical vehicle infrastructure, electrical vehicles completely, then you have a major labor force working in these gas stations that is not required at all. So it isn't just the direct dependence of the fossil fuel industry, of the finite material industry, but these indirect actors that are dependent on that industry as well. So you're now thinking of circular economy and just transitions in terms of not just education, but in terms of skill, right? You're dealing with one whole generation of people who have not upskilled themselves in a way that they could fit into any of these processes of circular economy. So that's the void that you're covering. There's one whole aspect of industry that makes more money if you extract more things, that makes more money if you have to not recycle their products. Think of a sneaker brand. Think of your favorite fashion brand. What will they do if you start refurbishing their shirts and shoes and tops and whatnot, right? There's a major financial negative attached with the private sector when it comes to circular economy. In the short run, in the long run, they have to spend less on their raw materials and resources, which gives them a larger profit eventually. Okay. So that's one of the major challenges of circular economy. I'm very conscious of the time as well, guys, because we have to make way for the ambassador in a bit. So I'm just going to give you those things that I was referring to at the beginning. So it isn't just about reduce, reuse, and recycle. It's actually these aspects of ours, as they're called, that need to be inculcated in behavioral systems of the species, of human species. So you have, at the very start of this whole circular economy process, the idea of refusing things that you do not require, you do not desire per se. You know, a good example to judge how much you have refused in your life, look at the stuff you have when you're moving houses. Would you have, are you lamenting that you did not refuse at that time when you were buying these things or being gifted these things? And the second things are rethinking your choices, rethinking your choices with waste and choices with inputs in your resources and reducing those resources going forward. Then you have the usual, as we covered, reuse, repair, refurbish, remanufacture, repurpose, very importantly. And then you have recycle and recovery. And recovering is where you're incinerating material. Recovering is where you're taking that aluminium and copper out of those products and reusing it for manufacturing. And so these are the 9 aspects that could be utilized to achieve a perfectly circular economy. Now, this is given that you have figured out skill-based learning for each of these aspects of the integrated loop, which is a very, very difficult aspect of circular economy. Then, if you have achieved these things, how do you explain where you stand on the integration of that circular economy, right? Because if you have achieved a certain level of circularity, how do I, and you're claiming it to be so, how do I verify that you've achieved any of these things? So for that, there are various indices that are now available. There's a resource efficiency scoreboard that is globally acceptable. There are EIEs, EIIs, eco-innovation indices, recycling rates, amount of municipal waste generated per capita. I think that's something that we do already. And the amount of waste per GDP output. So the amount of money that's coming into your country, how much waste is generated per that money that's coming in. So there are these basic indicators that are going about to judge how circular economy is. But then we encounter another trouble, which usually comes with informal economies or developing world, which is information asymmetry, lack of the perfect data set. Have you counted for every plastic cup that was thrown, and have you counted for every plastic straw that was littered and every plastic wrapper that was thrown on the street? Because you cannot count for it, each of these indices are, again, inherently lacking that impetus that is required to show the world that this is a perfectly circular economy. And that's where education and behavior changes come into the picture. And that's why I said that refusing and rethinking are very, very important aspects of this. And now in academia, you're seeing this change from what was design systems thinking issue is now becoming a behavioral issue. That's where this whole research is now heading, because ultimately it comes down to what you're doing with your consumption patterns, not necessarily with the manufacturing patterns, because manufacturing patterns are aspects of supply, and supply usually follows demand. So if there is a demand for it, you will probably have a supply for it. And that's what you're trying to curb through circular economy. Finally, there are certain opportunities and advantages that come through circular economy, and some of these are intuitive. So there are reduced pressures on environment. We saw that there are finite resources, and you keep them existing. You do not run them out as one would in terms of linear economy. And then you have the lack of CO2 emissions, you have the lack of water pollution, you have the lack of microplastics and other things that happen during the manufacturing process, because now it's an integrated loop. You also have a better supply chain system. because you know that eventually everything that is produced comes back to me. And hence you have cost incentives in terms of your supply chain, you have cost incentives in terms of your resourcing and sourcing of materials. There's more competitiveness because you now have to show that everyone is on a level playing field. Everyone has the same raw materials. So you have more competition with your competitors, which means that you have more innovation. And whether you agree or not, the fact of the matter is that innovation leads to efficiency, right? To maximize your profits in a competitive market, you'll have to keep on innovating with things that are just more efficient and more profitable. Finally, once you have figured out what are the various stages at which you would require skills, those skills of, someone, the skills that we just looked at, someone maintaining and reusing and refurbishing and recycling, each of these then becomes a major sector of your economy, right? There's a refurbishing sector instead of a mining sector. There's a recycling sector that is as big as a manufacturing sector and such. So you now have these big voids, these 5 big voids that are skilled jobs requiring a new advent of skills altogether, changing our education system, changing our professional systems, re-looking at where the demand is, where the supply is in terms of professional jobs. So you're looking at refurbishing not just your economic system, but system of human capital, how it is developed, how it is trained, how it is skilled, right? And that's why circular economy lends itself more to a sociological perspective as you go along, and not just a financial or economic perspective, as you understand circular economy better. Now, these advantages are all hunky-dory, but obviously there are some major challenges that come with it. One is you need capital investment to plug those holes, right? You need capital investment in terms of giving the personnel who are dependent on fossil fuel-based economy a skill or a job to make their living. Another sociological aspect of higher unemployment rates, in case you want to switch tomorrow to all of this, and a lot of the world becomes unemployed, is that the sociological consequences of unemployment aren't just the fact that there's a burden on your economy, on the taxpayer when someone's not working. It's also when people do not have skills to make a living. They feel helpless, and under criminology, you'll see that a lot of those people who felt helpless, where they could not earn their bread because they did not have the skill, not for their own fault, but because the governance systems did not allow them to gain certain skills, then such people might even choose a life of crime. So you have this whole new cycle of unemployment leading to crime, increase in crimes, criminology, and such. There are also pricing deficits, as you'll see that for the short-term future, you'll have a higher price to pay as consumer for goods that abide by circular economy, and that's why you'll see that farmers' markets are typically more expensive, despite the fact that it's all organic, which means that it is all from the nature itself, but that produces more expensive, and that's why there's a pricing deterrent at the beginning of the circular economy transition. I already addressed skills, how you need specialized skills for refurbishing and reusing and remanufacturing and using more things as you go along. Very importantly, probably one of the biggest challenges is convincing you and convincing me that this is the right way, that it is not okay just to throw something away thinking that I'll buy another one, or I'll I don't need it anymore, and when I need it, I'll buy another one. So changing consumption patterns, changing behavior becomes very important. And finally, none of this succeeds at any level if it does not succeed altogether at all levels. So even the concept of circular economy suffers from what we discussed at the very beginning of the session, which is leakage. you might have one governance system level which works perfectly in a circular way. But if there are other governance levels which are not circular in nature, then there will always be some gap in that perfectly integrated loop where new raw materials will keep on coming in, which means that there will always be abundance, and abundance usually leads to waste. So these are the most basic challenges that circular economy poses on an everyday level when you're trying to come up with systems. Now, having said that, you'll now see a lot of big industries moving towards circular economy. So you have the Nike reuse sneakers, you have IKEA doing stuff with refurbished furniture, but there's still a long, long, long way to go in this. So I think that's the end of our introduction to circular economy. And as I said, I'm right on time. I think we could take a couple of minutes break. I don't know, Arpit, if you're around, but we could probably take a couple of minutes break before we start with the ambassador. I'm also happy to take up questions, by the way, if there are any questions on circular economy or the practicality of it, or how we're all doomed and none of this is going to work. So there's no point discussing any of this anyway. Yeah, comments or observations about it.
Can I ask you a thing? Do you agree with the saying that, again, this is coming from a completely different culture, but I was brought up on it, that we're too poor to afford cheap things?
I've never heard that, but I'm going to write that down. And I think I'll have to spend a couple of hours just to understand the depth of that statement.
Yeah, but basically it says exactly what you were referring to, the fact that in a circular economy, and especially when we try to buy organic and bio products, they tend to be a bit more expensive.
Yeah.
And the idea with the linear economy is that when they produce these objects, they're all perishable. They go way easier than, the ones that are a bit more expensive. So what that saying basically is trying to relay is the fact that if you want something to last, then you should invest in the things that are a bit more expensive rather than buying a multitude of cheap things that are the same just to make them last a bit longer.
Yeah, I remember a couple of instances in my life when I have yeah, I understand what you're saying, Cynthia. Let me address a couple of questions that have come in the box as well, chat box as well. Yogesh asks, can we say phones not including charger and earphones and packaging as an example of circular economy? I'm not sure, because ultimately you're discarding the phones, and very rarely are you discarding the phones as form of e-waste for it to be recycled and incinerated eventually. So I'm not sure if phones make up a part of circular economy, unless we go to the integrated loop system and you extract everything out of the phone system and use it again as raw materials further. What is your view on developing countries requesting payment from developed countries to keep their natural resources intact? Well, Wayne, I'd invite you to check out the GPODS Fellowship, because that's actually the first lecture I deliver in the GPODS Fellowship, and it'll take a good 2 hours to discuss it at length. But I think there's a lot more to just the global South, global North debate when it comes to common but differentiated responsibility that you're referring to. Typically, so let me refer to a conversation that I was having with a judge a couple of days back, a Supreme Court justice from United States. And he was asked a question on the global North, global South divide and on carbon tax. And what he mentioned really struck a chord with me. He said that in both these cases, coming up with a solution to global North and global South and coming up with a carbon tax system, you require a governance change, okay? And historically, the quickest change in governments have been systemic changes of governments have taken at least 15 to 20 years, right? Which means that you're looking at moving to carbon tax in a 20-year timeline at best. And we simply do not have 20 years to refurbish our systems and move on to things that might be sustainable. Because if 2050 we do not go 1.5 degrees, then it becomes uninhabitable. We're already at 1.3, by the way, so we've done the long march. You can see the finish line of 1.5 degrees, which I think we should be able to, the way things are going, we will cross in the next 10 years, possibly. And the kind of repercussions that are happening, I would, for anyone who's interested in these things, I'd really invite you to read The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, because that's where he talks about statistics and talks about how cities like Karachi and Kolkata in 2050, stepping out of your houses during the day in those cities would be equivalent to undertaking fatal, lethal danger. And that's the kind of impact that we're talking about. Sorry, I really went on a bit of a rant there. Anyway, any other questions I'm happy to answer. I'm also happy to address any concerns that you might have about the doomsday scenario. I'd also love to hear optimists in the crowd. It's very difficult to have optimists who think that there's a way out. Agnes, are we talking to an optimist or a pessimist?
I'm not very optimistic, I'm afraid. So my
Welcome to the gang.
Yeah. My question is related to difference of powers and also different interests within the state, because obviously there was a recent analysis on the SDGs and the development of the UN and different states in that sense. And basically the projection is that we want to achieve the SDGs by 2070, which is a very scary deadline. But my question was, how do we balance these things? And especially how can we push these principles within society, also thinking about other interests like inflation, for example? Because right now inflation is a reality in a lot of countries, especially in the Western world. And usually the tactic of governments is trying to sell more, so there is more economy. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, but how can we push circular economy and a different view and possibly philosophy on how to use goods in society when there is possibly this effect as well? Thank you.
Excellent question. I'm not sure about degrowth, but I think degrowth will be an eventual consequence of this. Titli is referring to a debate that the GPOTS fellows had earlier. So it's a good question, Agnes. Let me phrase it this way. There was a study conducted, I'm not sure if it was UCLA or Berkeley, one of the two universities, which basically were trying to cut down on their students' energy consumption. And they tried everything, right? They had those town halls where they're speaking with the students that, cut down your energy emissions, and they did pamphlets and trying to convince people and get a conversation going about cutting down your energy consumption, and nothing happened. Nothing worked. And then some person in the student community suggested that let's rate community housing. So you will be rated against your neighbor on how you've done on your energy consumption. And lo and behold, in the next electricity bill, everyone was given a rating, how they ranked against their neighbors and against their competitors from other parts of the globe. And you saw a sudden decline in energy consumption because people then start getting competitive against each other. And what that meant is that they now had to be number one. They had to be rank one, which means that they'll cut down on their energy consumption. The reason why I'm mentioning this is because ecocentric behavior, circular economy is typically ecocentric. Ecocentric behavior is an end. It does not mean that all the means have to be ecocentric. Sometimes you have to appeal to the anthropocentric side of human beings in terms of human psychology and behavioral psychology to appeal to that selfish nature and competing with each other, to appearing to be more green, to being more green. So it's a larger behavioral discussion that needs to be had. but we're being joined by our guest of honor for this evening. So I'll hand it over to Arpit, and Arpit could take it over from here. Thank you, guys. You've been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was GPOD's Joint Director, Eeshan. And now we have